Alrighty, why don't we make a start here? Welcome everyone to Green College. Welcome on a very wonderful winter evening. We've got lots of pow today, and whilst it's cold, we've got a fantastic topic to warm our hearts, souls, and our brains tonight. For those who are new to Green College, we just always start off by situating ourselves on traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. For those who are new, Green College is a graduate residence comprised of master's, PhD, and some professional degrees as well. We all are comprised here as residents who give talks on Monday nights, and we're delighted to have Mark with us tonight. Mark is a PhD student in the Faculty of Law, and he will be presenting on the topic entitled Ecocentric Constitutional Law, What, Why, and How. Following Mark's presentation, we will then open up the floor for any questions. So if you're tuning in online or in person, we will attend to those at the end. But without further ado, please do join me in welcoming Mark.
Tēnā koutou katoa. No Afrika ki te tonga ahau, ko Aotearoa tōku kāinga mō ngā tau e ruatakau mawha. I noho ahau i a Tāmaki Makaurau me te whanganui atara. Nāia nei, e ako ana ahau i te whariwānanga o British Columbia. Kei te mihi ahau ki ngā tangata whenua o Aotearoa, ki ngā tangata Māori. Kei te mihi ahau ki ngā tangata whenua o te rohi nei, ki ngā tangata Musqua. Kei te mihi ahau ki te whānau o te Karati Kakariki, o te Green College. Ko Howard tōku whānau, ko Mark tōku ingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So, hello everyone. It's great to see you all here. I wanted to start today's presentation with mihi whakatau. This is a custom rooted in tikanga Māori that has become used in the wider culture of Aotearoa New Zealand today. It's a chance to share one's identity and to make acknowledgements ahead of a presentation like this one. So some of the things that I shared with you in Te Reo Māori were my South African heritage, the fact that I have called Aotearoa New Zealand home now for 24 years, the fact that I lived in both Auckland and Wellington before coming to study here at UBC. I also express my gratitude and acknowledgement towards those whose land in which I've lived and learnt, to Māori as the tangata whenua of Aotearoa, and of course to the Musqueam people as the first and still presiding nation on this land under our feet. And finally, I acknowledge the wonderful family of Green College, my host not just for tonight, but for the past 4 months. It's so wonderful to see so many of you here tonight in attendance. A quick bit about me and sort of what gives me the right to stand here and talk about these sort of things tonight. So I graduated from Waipapa Taumata Rau, the University of Auckland, in 2020 with an LLB as a Bachelor of Laws and a Bachelor of Arts in Education. And that was a 5-year-long degree, but I clearly am a sucker for punishment because I immediately came back and did a master's. I did my master's in law, which I graduated with distinction in 2021, and that was specialising in international law. I then went on to be admitted as a barrister and solicitor of the High Court of Aotearoa New Zealand in 2022. And I went to go work in Wellington in educational policy, which I really enjoyed, but I also couldn't scratch that itch of sort of academic research and writing. So I thought, well, maybe I'll give it a go to publishing my master's research. And I managed to do so in 2022 in the New Zealand Journal of Environmental Law. And that article was sort of the basis for my presentation tonight. Fast forward a few years and that itch still couldn't be scratched, and so I decided, well, I better try the next challenge, and so I signed up to a PhD, which I'm very, very proud to be completing up the road at the Peter A. Allard School of Law here at UBC, of course. So, what are we going to talk about tonight? We are going to discuss ecocentric constitutional law, otherwise known as eco-constitutionalism. And we're going to kind of examine it through 3 elements. Firstly, what is eco-constitutionalism? Secondly, why is it useful for addressing climate change? And thirdly, how might it be legitimately implemented within neocolonial contexts? And specifically tonight, I'll be looking at the context of Aotearoa New Zealand. A few disclaimers before we go any further. Firstly, this is absolutely not comprehensive. This is a very high-level overview. In fact, it's even less ambitious than I had thought when I wrote my blurb, because I quickly realized I was running out of time when I did my rehearsal earlier today. So it's going to be very high level, but also I think in a way that will hopefully help us be engaging for an interdisciplinary audience. So to our lawyers and jurists in the room, I apologize if it's not quite as down in the weeds as you might like, but I'm very happy to talk about details at any other time. And another thing to note is it's not universal, so don't go slapping this theory onto any old jurisdiction. It's very much rooted in my experience studying and researching law in Aotearoa, and as you'll see in particular in terms of the how section, that's very much where it is based. And saying that, I do think there's a lot of lessons for Canada here, which we may be able to get to, time depending, given the similarities between New Zealand and Canada as modern jurisdictions. All right, let's get into the what. So what is eco-constitutionalism? Essentially, it is a synthesis of two ideas, constitutional law and ecocentrism. So we're going to go through those two things first, and that'll bring us to the broader idea of ecocentric constitutional law. So constitutional law, very basic stuff. I'm sure many of you are familiar. It is the highest form of law in a given jurisdiction. It is generally characterized by unique features, two in particular, perpetuity and supremacy. So perpetuity is the idea that constitutional law cannot change easily. It lasts for a very long time. If you want to change it, you generally have to get a significant degree of political support in order to achieve what is often referred to as a supermajority vote. So you can't just pass it, you can't amend it with a sort of a 51% vote threshold in Parliament. You need to be hitting higher numbers, typically 66 or 75, or sometimes you can only have to hit 50%, but it has to be regionally distributed across the entire country. The bottom line is it's hard to change once it's in there. The second feature is supremacy. So constitutional law sets the course for all lesser law. All lesser law must be aligned with constitutional values. If it fails to do so, then the judiciary, so the courts, can step in and pass judgments in order to bring the law back in line with constitutional values. In most cases, there's always exceptions to these sort of things. Another kind of unique feature about constitutional law is that it carries enormous moral and cultural weight. Abet's Internet in 2013 described this phenomenon of constitutional sanctity, which I'm really interested in. The idea that when people think about their constitution within their home country, particularly within sort of the big constitutional republics of America and indeed Canada, New Zealand, Australia, they tend to get into this kind of fervour, where they're really dedicated to this idea, the Constitution, it becomes a messianic figure for democracy, liberty, freedom, the values that those particular jurisdictions hold in high regard. And therefore, on one hand, it influences the culture quite significantly, but on the other hand, the culture is very resistant to changing the Constitution, which becomes a problem for theories such as this one, as we will see in due course. So Clavers in 2004 sort of used quite neat terminology, I think, which is that constitutional law determines the order of not just the law, but political discourse. So when politicians are discussing policy and upcoming agendas within Parliament, they want to make sure that they're aligned with the Constitution, or at least perceived as being aligned with the Constitution. Because if not, of course, this has ramifications for what's going to happen when their policy passes, and it might be found unconstitutional, it might be overturned. And I want to briefly address a myth here, a common misconception, which is that constitutions are individual written documents. This is simply not true. Constitutions are generally far more complex kind of creatures than that. And even when we think about the US with its sort of singular document of the Constitution, as I know Mike would certainly argue, that is only one component of the broader constitutional network in that nation. And the same is certainly true of Canada and New Zealand, where multiple documents and many other features make up their constitutional frameworks. All right, ecocentrism. So what is this? Well, it's a very broad concept, and there are many, many different views. I'm approaching it from one particular angle and one particular, legal tradition. But we could summarize it at a high level as viewing ecological well-being as a prerequisite to the survival of life on Earth. So if you don't have ecological well-being, what is going to happen to civilization, to society, to the economy? All these things are built upon the basis that we have a healthy planet which can be home to at least life as we recognize it. And therefore, the long-term relationship with ecosystems must be prioritized over short-term social economic gains. This contrasts with anthropocentrism, which is the prioritization of human interests over wider ecological needs. This is a theory in law, policy, many fields, which I feel describes my particular approach to ecocentrism quite well. It is the weak sustainability versus strong sustainability model. So on the left hand, right hand? I was temporarily forgetting my directions. But the weak sustainability model, based in Brundtland in 1987, this is the model that most of us, I think, would be familiar with from things like the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. It envisions developments in three broad categories. You have your economic development, your social developments, and your natural or environmental or ecological developments. And that latter category very much refers to essentially environmental protection. So something like deforestation would fall more likely within the economic developments category, because presumably you're doing it to get an economic output, whereas something like reforestation might fall within the environmental developments category. And in weak sustainability, you try and balance all three of these pillars equally, which, on paper seems like a good idea. The problem, and this is sort of the common critique from a long tradition of scholars, starting with Giddings in 2002, is that the playing field is not equal. So you put these three characters out there as if they have the same footing, but within our global consumerist capitalist order, economic development quickly runs right ahead of the other two, especially natural/environmental development, which tends to get left in the dust or subverted into economical purposes. Which led to the idea of advocating for a shift to strong sustainability. Strong sustainability rather views that given the prerequisite of a healthy environment to anything else and that human civilization can produce, that social and economic development should be nested within ecological well-being and needs. How do you delineate those margins? There are many approaches. One such approach is scientific ecocentrism. This is obviously, using one particular kind of Western mainstream method of science, not to discredit other forms of science out there at all. But this is one that I'm particularly interested in. It utilizes these sort of various earth science concepts to try and identify where those limits for the, I'm using a laser pointer, those limits for the strong sustainability layer might be. Two such concepts which are quite common in the field of eco-constitutionalism are ecological integrity. This is generally described as the notion that ecosystems are best able to sustain themselves when they are free from external influence, particularly anthropogenic external influence, given our sort of unique power to dominate ecosystems with modern technology. And similarly, planetary boundaries are another commonly used concept, and planetary boundaries are the delineated limits beyond which... Oh, I don't know why that's happened. Do I need to press the button? Okay. Maybe I'll get some help from... Thank you very much, Aaron. Well, I'll just keep on talking anyway. And so, it's back. Magic touch. Perfect. Planetary boundaries are the delineated marcations beyond which anthropogenic interference cannot go if an ecosystem is going to maintain its integrity. So that safe operating space in the middle, that green circle, that's sort of the bounds in which ecological integrity kicks in and an ecosystem can sustain itself. And those red lines coming out represent anthropogenic influence that is pushing past those safe operating spaces, pushing past the limits of ecological integrity. What justifies ecocentrism? Well, as I said, it sort of bases its idea on the fact that we need a healthy planet to have a healthy society, a healthy economy, a healthy life in general. And the worsening climate crisis shows that that merely balancing of ecological well-being with economic development and social development is insufficient. Greed and reckless economic growth are winning out. There's also an additional point, which is quite important to bear in mind, is that ecosystems are connected in highly complex ways. This is something that is very apparent within many different bodies of literature. And the bottom line is that it can be very difficult, if not impossible, to predict if ecological harm can be isolated, which makes cost-benefit analyses really hard to do. You can't sort of simply walk over to a sort of glade of trees and say, oh yes, well, we'll do a brief kind of overview and it looks like everything's in order and there's no immediate environmental harm if we chop it all down, so we'll chop it all down and reap the rewards. Ecocentrism would say, hang on, it's not so simple. there might be many factors at play that in the long term could cause degradation. But because we tend to approach things from a short-term anthropocentric viewpoint, we often overlook those nuances. And I think that is very well demonstrated in what I think is the next slide. Oh, never mind. We'll get to it in a moment. Eco-constitutionalism. What is eco-constitutionalism then? Essentially, it is the embedding of constitutional law with entrenched ecocentric principles. So in an ideal eco-constitution, ecological integrity, well-being, planetary boundaries determine the order of political discourse and human ambitions. They become the primary source of the state's authority. The state cannot act in a way that contravenes those crucial planetary boundaries. As a result, it is able to offer powerful intergenerational environmental protections that can endure short-term political shifts that arise, for example, in election cycles. What does eco-constitutionalism look like in action? Well, there's a host of different mechanisms by which scholars have argued it can manifest. The number one common theme is rights of nature, also known as environmental personhood. So this is a growing trend in national domestic legal systems around the world, in which natural entities are prescribed rights directly in recognition of the fact that they have rights which they are able to uphold themselves and seek recourse for when they are breached. These rights can be substantive, so for example, rights to ecological health. They can also be procedural, so for example, access to ecological information. And it's actually quite a fascinating area of law, is granting natural entities procedural rights, because it can actually very well be done, although it might seem bizarre from our particular perspective to imagine a tree getting access to ecological information. This can be done within the bounds of the law. Something else that eco-constitutionalism is gradually recognising, and I'm glad to see it, is intersectional rights, so recognising that the climate crisis is a crisis that intersects with many other crises within humanity. One of the most significant being the colonial crisis, the ongoing impact of colonialisation on land and resources. And therefore, eco-constitutionalism literature tries to, and has a long way to go as well, in recognising Indigenous rights and sovereignty within its broader message. And finally, responsibility. So typically, constitutions try and not only impose rights, but also actual responsibilities upon the state or even private entities such as corporations or citizens to respect and care for ecological integrity. And a common theme across all of these is that you have to have a very high threshold if you're going to breach ecological integrity. There's no point in having all these protections if you then provide 100 different situations in which it's perfectly acceptable to stomp all over the planet. So usually the limitations are described as you need to have an urgent need to protect other interests, and there needs to be no reasonable alternative. Now, of course, these lines are hard to delineate, and there is a lot of literature out there trying to explore what kind of optimal lines might be. One of the most important messages is it always needs to be decided in a localized context, so it won't be the same across different jurisdictions. Eco-constitutionalism is distinct from a few bodies, which I want to briefly talk about. Firstly, environmental constitutional law. Hundreds of constitutions around the world have environmental protections or references in them. That doesn't make those constitutions eco-constitutions, and the main reason why is almost always those rights are framed as human rights, which means their enforceability is limited to situations in which human interests, life, liberty, and property are being impacted, and they can't easily, or often can't at all, be enforced in the absence of short-term human concerns. And now I remember the next slide is indeed the case, which will highlight that quite well. Sub-constitutional ecocentric law is another thing that is distinct from eco-constitutionalism. So there's a growing trend around the world in domestic legal systems to recognise the rights of nature, for example. For example, in New Zealand, the Te Awa Tupua Act and the Uwerewera Act grant rights of nature to the Wanganui River and the Uwerewera Ranges, respectively. But they are not done at a constitutional level. So any day of the week, Parliament can come with a 51% majority and tear those bills to pieces. They don't have that perpetuity and that supremacy that constitutional law carries. Some ecocentric trends that do carry that perpetuity and supremacy are what I refer to as quasi-eco-constitutions, and those can be found within the nations of Ecuador and Bolivia most prominently. So these are very powerful constitutional documents that set out in very strong language the fact that in those cases, essentially the entire land within those countries has rights. They are actionable rights which can be sought in the absence even of short-term human interests. The problem with those eco-constitutions is they tend to leave a lot of loopholes. The loophole problem kicks in. There are many grounds by which industrial developments or even unnecessary economic growth can override those rights, which begins to create problems, of course, because you sort of give a little and you give a little bit more, and suddenly your rights framework isn't doing all that much to protect the environment. And finally, eco-constitutionalism is distinct from violent ecocentric reform. Ecocentrism has its radicals, unfortunately, like any idea, and I have had people before accuse me of being an eco-fascist, for example, so I want to make it very clear that my approach to eco-constitutionalism, and indeed all the approaches in mainstream literature, is to pursue eco-constitutionalism through the bounds of the law in a legitimate fashion, as opposed to, say, violent revolution. So that is not its intention. Okay, this is the case that I love a lot. This is Naiwansa Temple Mitam and the Friends of the Salamanders and Korea Rail Network Authority. It's a 2006 South Korean Supreme Court case. And this case summarizes quite neatly the difference between environmental constitutional law and eco-constitutional law. Essentially, in a nutshell, what happened is the plaintiffs challenged the construction of a railroad that was going to run through a sort of forested area. And they claimed that this construction of the railroad would violate a constitutional right in the South Korean constitution to enjoy a healthy environment. So everyone has a right to enjoy a healthy environment. The problem was the railroad wasn't really impacting human rights all that much. You know, it was not going to be a significant, massive industrial project. The trees would still be kind of viewable and enjoyable for someone walking down the road, and there wasn't going to be all that much air pollution. So instead, the Friends of the Salamanders and the local temples sought to invoke the right on behalf of local salamanders. And these salamanders, the plaintiffs argued, were going to be highly endangered by the construction of this railroad. In fact, it was going to go straight through their territory. So from a human perspective, there is no real environmental degradation going on here. But from the perspective of a little salamander, it's their entire world is getting ripped up by these metal machines. And the Supreme Court of Korea took one look at this and, you know, perhaps predictably dismissed it. And they said, this is rubbish. There's nothing within the South Korean constitution that says that we need to consider the rights of salamanders. Only humans have the right to a healthy environment. And this, as I say, highlights the problem with environmental constitutional law, is it tends to look at things only from that short-term, shallow human perspective, and it runs the risk of not considering what happens if you were to look at an ecosystem from the perspective of a salamander. Earth science tells us that even something as small as a salamander can, if degraded to the point of extinction, have a massive long-term chain reaction on wider ecosystems. And there are many examples of this throughout recent history. So the problem here isn't that the salamanders lost. I'm fine if the salamanders have to lose, that's fine by me, and that's fine with eco-constitutionalism. But what it requires is that there be a deeper assessment undertaken from an ecocentric perspective. Don't just assume that everything's fine because humans aren't going to be impacted in the next 5 to 10 years. Okay, why? Why eco-constitutionalism? Well, there are several reasons. Firstly, I want to make the point, an axiom, that the anthropogenic climate crisis is getting worse. I'm not really going to expand on this. If you don't agree with me, you're probably not going to enjoy this presentation as a whole. There are many sources which I can point you towards if you really need. Secondly, environmental law is a necessary tool to resolving the crisis. So this starts to get a bit more controversial. Why can't we just sit back and rely on technology or market solutions to fix the crisis for us? Well, there's a lot of literature on this, and one of the leading arguments which I prescribe to is the fact that technology and market solutions are driven by profit. They're driven by economic development, not by ecological development. So if you rely exclusively on these methods, and it's not to say they're bad, these things have a role to play, of course, but if you rely exclusively or heavily on them, the risk you run is that economic development continues to be prioritized over ecological development. Law has the ability to regulate human interactions with the environment in a way that actually prioritizes the environment, because it can, if done correctly, and as I argue within the bounds of eco-constitutionalism, become immune to the influence of economics and politics, which is my next point, that current environmental law is ineffective because it is too susceptible to political and economic interests. And I cite a particularly interesting study here, which is House et al. 2017. They do a big review of a whole bunch of different jurisdictions and how their environmental legal frameworks are supporting their sort of attempts at sustainability, and they find that one of the most consistent points of failure is that is that environmental law is too susceptible to these political and economic influences. It can be changed, it can be set aside in order to build a new factory, to mine that mountain, to pollute that river. Constitutional law, on the other hand, sets the order of political discourse, as we know, and influences deep-seated cultural values. Not only is it immune to political and economic interests, it actually sets those interests. So it has this unique power that regular environmental law doesn't have in order to go beyond and to form that strong sustainability shell. Okay, evidence of success. Someone asked me ahead of time, do I have any metrics or evidence to prove my success? Well, look, there's no genuine implementation of eco-constitutionalism among modern nation states. Eco-constitutionalism exists in many forms, I would argue, among Indigenous communities, First Nations, but at large scales of the nation state, we have not seen it in practice. So it is genuinely hard to say. Like many ideas, we may not know until we give it a try. That's not to say that we shouldn't try it. Although I did critique Ecuador and Bolivia's constitutions earlier, there is some promise to be seen. Court cases in those countries are actually getting awards, they're getting injunctions based on the rights of nature. They are running into obstacles, for example, through the loopholes that I mentioned earlier, and also through institutional corruption. But loopholes can be closed and corruption can be managed. So these are not insurmountable obstacles for eco-constitutionalism. All right. How? Let's speed through this. And this is, again, a very high-level sort of framework of my arguments made in my New Zealand Journal of Environmental Law article. The scope that I want to limit this how section to, and by how, of course, I mean how can we achieve eco-constitutionalism, how can we actually get from where we are today to this state. Firstly, I want to look, as I said, at legitimately approaching this through existing legal avenues. I'm not advocating for revolution, personally. And secondly, I'm limiting my scope to the Constitution of Aotearoa, New Zealand. But once again, I think there are lessons to be learned for Canada here, which, yeah, maybe we can get to in question time. I was meant to have a slide, but then I was worried I was going to take a lot longer than I have, and so I took the slide out. So, lessons for next time, I suppose. Okay, so we want to implement an eco-constitution. Where do we go? In New Zealand, you might start with the legislature or parliament. And as I said earlier, if you're going to amend a constitution within Parliament, you need a supermajority. You need that 66% or 75% of votes in order to actually make those significant changes possible. And it can be done with a vote in the House or a petition of voting age citizens. The problem is that is a very difficult obstacle to achieve that would take probably decades of advocacy. Remember, we have constitutional sanctity to deal with. People rarely get worked up when you critique their constitution, and the Constitution of New Zealand is, and as it is with many countries in the world, an anthropocentric one. So eco-constitutionalism represents, from an anthropocentric perspective, a massive threat. You're getting rid, from their perspective, you're getting rid of human rights and replacing them with these ecocentric rights. It doesn't feel aligned with those fundamental values that you have been raised with. And one concern is that perhaps we don't have that time. We know that the climate crisis is urgent. This might justify the need to explore other avenues for constitutional change. So if not through Parliament, then where do you go? Well, you might go to the judiciary or the courts. If you can persuade the Supreme Court that eco-constitutional duties already exist within the Constitution, in this case the Constitution of Aotearoa, then the court is able to give effect to those duties without needing a law change. So notice that we've changed gears here. Here we're talking about formally changing constitutional law. Here we have to use a different argument, and the argument we're using is, can we find eco-constitutional obligations already existing within constitutional law? So, can we? Let's see. In the context of New Zealand, in my 2022 article, I argue that there's one particularly unique and powerful pillar of the Constitution that has the potential to work in this manner, and that is the Treaty of Waitangi, Te Tiriti o Waitangi. This is the founding document of Aotearoa New Zealand as in the modern state, and the treaty is a treaty between Māori and the Crown, signed in 1840, agreeing to coexist as peoples in the same land. That is at least the mainstream view among legal academics, in my opinion. There are others who would say other things. At the moment, you may have seen in the news, we have a fair share of politicians who are saying that no, clearly Māori intend to completely surrender their sovereignty and submit themselves to the Crown. In my view, that is completely wrong. The treaty guarantees many things. Two of the things it guarantees are rangatiratanga, which is often translated to mean sovereignty, so rangatiratanga to Māori in particular, and it also guarantees Māori the right to practice tikanga, or Māori law. So, in my 2022 article, I draw on a range of sources, and in this presentation I'm mostly just paraphrasing from the Waitangi Tribunal's excellent 2011 Y262 report. Exercising the rangatiratanga in line with tikanga is reliant on practicing kaitiakitanga. And kaitiakitanga is often translated as something like guardianship or trusteeship, but the reality is there's no good English translation. Those are kind of approximations we can use to help us understand this element of tikanga. And kaitiakitanga is typically protected towards, or is typically carried out towards the land. It is a very complex topic, yet I have attempted to summarize it in like 3 lines on a PowerPoint slide. If you're interested in kaitiakitanga, please go elsewhere and I can try and point you to some sources, but this is not the sole place to learn about it at all. But doing my best to paraphrase from the Waitangi Tribunal, one way of understanding kaitiakitanga, and in many ways the heart of kaitiakitanga, is that it is a duty to nurture and protect things with which one has kinship. And for Māori, this extends to plants, animals, rivers, mountains, and more. In this respect, kaitiakitanga may be understood as an ecocentric obligation that exists within Māori constitutional law. So, because kaitiakitanga is necessary to practice, as I say, rangatiratanga, good rangatiratanga requires that kaitiakitanga element. Generally speaking, again, and also I'm not an expert in tikanga, so there may be many exceptions that I'm unaware of, but this is, according to the Waitangi Tribunal, the general practice. It follows that when the Crown guaranteed rangatiratanga and guaranteed tikanga to Māori, it must also have inferred that kaitiakitanga is guaranteed, and that Māori are able to practice kaitiakitanga as they always have. And this is not particularly controversial. The Supreme Court has essentially said as much in their 2021 decision, Trans-Tasman Resources Limited and Taranaki Wanganui Conservation Board. So, that's all established. So far, everything I've said is pretty established. Now we're going to take a leap together, a bit of an academic leap, I acknowledge, but I think one that is sound. And it essentially runs along these lines. If the Crown has guaranteed kaitiakitanga through rangatiratanga in the Treaty of Waitangi, it surely must follow that the Crown's own must consider how its own actions might impair the ability of Māori to carry out kaitiakitanga on their land, whenever it initiates an environmental project, or even just on a day-to-day basis. The rationale for this, right, is I'm not saying the Crown has kaitiakitanga. In my view, the Crown can't have kaitiakitanga. That's something that you have to have, that kinship element, that whakapapa element, which only tangata whenua have, not the Crown. But the Crown has guaranteed it. The Crown obviously purports to own much of the land in New Zealand. It would be incredibly bad faith if the Crown were to say, okay, here's a mountain range or a forest which we're going to extract as much as possible, leave a steaming wasteland, and here you go guys, you can come and practice your kaitiakitanga now, good luck. That's just completely out of line with my reading of the Treaty of Waitangi. Hence it follows, I argue, that kaitiakitanga creates a broader ecocentric duty within the Constitution of Aotearoa. It sets a responsibility. Remember earlier I mentioned responsibilities, and it sets a very strong one that the Crown must actively be engaging with when it interacts with the land. Okay. We're going to run into a significant issue now. So, we have argued that the Treaty of Waitangi contains within it an obligation for the Crown to act in good faith to allow Māori to exercise kaitiakitanga, which requires the Crown also play a role in looking after the land. Good. The issue is a thing called parliamentary supremacy, which is a major feature of New Zealand's constitution. Parliamentary supremacy essentially says that Parliament has absolute supremacy to make any laws that it wants, with some very, very, very rare exceptions. The first thing you learn in most law schools in New Zealand is that Parliament can kill blue-eyed babies. This is not a hyperbole. In theory, if Parliament wanted to, tomorrow in New Zealand, it could pass an act with a mere 51% majority saying that all blue-eyed babies would be done away with. And there's nothing that anyone could do, according to the letter of the law, to stop it. I mean, obviously you could, revolt or something like that, but in terms of the courts, they would be bound by this constitutional principle, because New Zealand has absolute faith in its democracy to deliver the best possible outcomes, which means that if that democracy delivers objectively evil outcomes, they can't hold it back. It's sort of too late. So, of course, if this can happen to something as outrageous as the killing of blue-eyed babies, then of course you can imagine the courts will be very unlikely to recognise that kaitiakitanga or the Treaty of Waitangi supersede parliamentary supremacy. It's much more likely that it would say, no, Parliament has supremacy, it's allowed to do what it likes. And the reality is that the New Zealand Parliament has passed many, many acts that one could arguably, could make quite a good case are not ecocentric. It is allowed for offshore sea drilling, it is allowed for mass mining, deforestation, consumption of fossil fuels, you name it. So from the court's perspective, those things were passed with parliamentary supremacy, so the Treaty of Waitangi can't stop them. And again, there might be limitations, but generally those limitations are where the Parliament has said we are willing to allow ourselves to be bound by the Treaty of Waitangi, which they may or may not do in different contexts, and certainly do not do to the level that I'm arguing. However, there is an untested secret weapon, the chickens, or a case called Taylor and New Zealand Poultry Board, which was ruled on in 1984 by the New Zealand Court of Appeal. And in this case, essentially what happened is a man, Taylor, was selling eggs. And he was selling eggs at a time in which the sale of eggs was heavily restricted by the New Zealand government for various reasons. And Mr. Taylor was not abiding by these restrictions. In fact, he was driving a van, if memory serves me well, a van full of eggs, which had not been tested in the correct fashion, or whatever it may have been, when he was pulled over by a poultry inspection officer, or something along those lines, to investigate the contents of his van. So Mr. Taylor begrudgingly gets out and opens the van and reveals hundreds of untested eggs. And the poultry officer says, "What the hell is this? Can you explain?" And Mr. Taylor says, adamantly, "These aren't eggs, these are potatoes." And this goes on to the great frustration of the poultry board officer for a very long time. Eventually, Mr. Taylor, he can't hold out, and the evidence is overwhelmingly against him, so he acknowledges that no, they are, in fact, illegal eggs. But during the judgments, Lord Cook, he makes the judgment, he makes the decision, but he also engages in a little bit of what we call in the law obiter dictum, which is essentially commentary that has not become binding case law. It's sort of just the courts going off on a bit of a tangent to talk about interesting features of the law that may or may not be true. And one of the things Lord Cook says in his musings is, what if Mr. Taylor had been taken away and Parliament had said, with a 51% majority, Mr. Taylor, in order to make you confess that your potatoes are indeed eggs, we will torture you until you reveal that information to us. Would Parliament be allowed to do that? Essentially, Lord Cook is questioning the blue eyes baby logic. And Lord Cook says no, he doesn't think that would be the case, because he argues that certain rights within New Zealand common law run so deep that they must have essentially a kind of constitutional element which Parliament cannot go beyond. Now, Taylor has never become formal law in New Zealand, but nor has it directly been confronted and dismissed at the Supreme Court level. So that is to say, it remains untested. And it is possible, I would argue, certainly in the case of blue-eyed babies being killed, that you could invoke those Taylor limits. But I would also argue, why not for the Treaty of Waitangi? It's already recognised as a fundamental part of New Zealand's constitution. It serves a crucial role, and for reasons that I don't have time to get into, at least immediately, it is, in fact, an underpinning of the whole legitimacy of the state. The only reason the Crown can be there is because of the Treaty of Waitangi. So does this not make an excellent candidate for Taylor limits to apply to? And if there's any New Zealand lawyers listening on the call, I know you're probably not very happy with that arguments, but we'll talk about it later. So, the final recipe Firstly, you need to establish the Treaty of Waitangi requires the Crown to consider and uphold the practice of katiakitanga by Māori. I would say reasonably easy to do. Secondly, you have to establish that to fulfil this requirement, the Crown must have their own duty to protect ecosystems. As I say, it would be bad faith for the Crown to trash the land whilst claiming to support katiakitanga. This is kind of already recognised, in certain respects, but not to the level which I'm saying. But I do think there is room to make this argument. And thirdly, probably the hardest argument, is that establishing that the Treaty of Waitangi and hence the duty to enable the practice of katiakitanga runs so deep within New Zealand's constitution that it must be subject to tailor limits on parliamentary supremacy, or something like them for lawyers listening in from New Zealand. At this point, I cut out my slides as I thought I'd be going way over time, and I guess I'm at 40 minutes. So that is the end of the presentation, but, what did I do there? Keep it open. But thank you everyone, and I'm happy to entertain any questions.